Pretty scary, huh? Hi, I'm Stu, and if you're like me, you hate this shit. No video game does the jump scare better than the original Dead Space. But why are they so effective? Jump scares have been a part of the horror genre since the very beginning, but more often than not, they can feel like a cheap way to get a reaction out of an audience. Sometimes, however, there are jump scares that will stay with the audience long after the credits roll, and will have you checking every corner and keeping the lights on. Before we begin, I just want to get some basic definitions out of the way so we can be clear on what we're talking about. Let's break it down. First, I want to talk about horror and terror. Horror is the feeling of disgust that usually follows a frightening sight, sound, or experience. Terror is the feeling of dread and anticipation before the horrifying experience. The two so often get lumped together under the broader horror genre that they can get mixed up, but in Dead Space, the distinction is clear. Let's show that necromorph again. This is horror. This is terror. And when I talk about a cheap jump scare, I'm really talking about a scare that has no terror within the horror of the jump scare itself. I feel like a jump scare needs to be the catharsis of all of the terror that has built up before it. It's the terror of an unknown room, the terror of not knowing what's around the corner. They all deserve a scare to cut the tension. And this is where Dead Space is a masterpiece. Dead Space never presents you with a cheap jump scare. In 11 hours of playing, I never scoffed at my TV, uttered a, "Oh, f*** you," or wanted to throw my controller out the window. Well, that one I actually did, but that was because of those environmental puzzles near the end. God. I did get scared, though. A lot. Oh my God. That was the logo screen. But the reason these scares and horrifying sights never felt cheap was because of Dead Space openly communicates to you how you are going to get scared. Necromorphs always come out of vents unless they're already mulling around in the areas you have stepped into. You can chart precisely where they will appear, sometimes even seeing them drop down or scuttle along the ventilation of the Ishimura before popping out with a musical sting to give you a big hug. The ventilation shafts also burst wide open when they jump out, so you have a visual marker of where they are coming from. One of the greatest examples of this communication is during the lead up to the Leviathan encounter. After leaving the greenhouses and hydroponics, you'll enter a door towards food storage, and this happens. At first I felt confused and a little cheated by this otherwise unexpected scare, but then I realized I knew this was coming. There were these massive holes ripped out of the Ishimura leading up to hydroponics, which I assumed to be more spaces for the regular necromorphs, or more specifically those tentacle-headed ones, to crawl out of. I mean, that's weird, but I thought it was just more of that environmental storytelling. What I realized is that wasn't just a scene to get my imagination going, I was being warned. And this comes to the other way that Dead Space expertly crafts its scares. In Dead Space, you do a lot of backtracking. In pure Metroidvania style, you revisit spaces with new knowledge of which doors are unlocked, and new abilities to use to traverse the Ishimura. Walking back over a corpse I thought I had chopped up, only to hear the musical sting and watch it rise up behind me was horrifying and simultaneously brilliant. A jump scare that changes how you think about your environment, subverts your expectations, and adds to the terror of the game is a well done jump scare to me. Also, it had me checking every dead necromorph just to be sure that they weren't playing dead. Speaking of subverting your expectations, let's talk about elevators. Aside from a close call at the beginning of the game, elevators are a safe space. even safer than most safe rooms in-game. That is, until you get to the mining decks. I didn't think anything of it. I thought it was just another loading elevator, you know, maybe some whispers or scuttling around in the vents like normal. But all of a sudden, in full Metal Gear Solid fashion, I was surrounded by a group of necormorphs. After that, I was sure not to let my guard down on any elevator ride. This subversion of the world's rules allows horror and terror to actively feed each other instead of creating a pipeline where horror can only ever react to terror. And all this is bolstered by the design elements of the original Dead Space. The Necromorph's OG design, as well as every iteration that comes up, are incredibly well crafted. Sound design is also extremely important. The musical sting I keep mentioning sets your nerves on edge, and the combinations of baby cries, animal noises, and guttural spewing all make the beast's calls and screams a horrific encounter. In Dead Space, in order to progress through the story, you have to engage with the horror it has to offer. But here's the thing, horror is fleeting. I love this definition by Gothic horror writer Anne Radcliffe when talking about the difference between terror and horror. Horror contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates the soul. After about chapter 6 or 7, my whole Dead Space experience became an exhausting slog through rooms with the same jump scare setup. The scares were never cheap, they were just expected. This pattern of the same scare, room to room, really started to wear me down. But what kept me playing, and kept me utterly terrified, were the environments. I found myself more terrified than horrified as the game went on. Gurgling walls of alien biology, the greenhouses with the canned forest noise, the super tight whisper-filled hallways of the executive levels, these all kept me on edge so that jump scares were still effective. And even if it overstays its welcome in the horror department, the terror of each new environment of the Ishimura, the Valor, and the Colony kept me on the edge of my seat. I don't want to talk too much about terror because that's the next video, but I want to say what makes Dead Space such a fantastic horror genre experience overall is it combines the best elements of horror and terror. Again, Anne Radcliffe says it better than I ever could. Terror expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. This reliance on imagination, anticipation, and expansion is what I love about the horror genre and is executed so fantastically within the first Dead Space. But instead of relying on what makes just Dead Space terrifying, I want to link it to a section of the horror genre that seems to be born out of the internet and taking the indie horror game scene by storm. The liminal space. Sorry, that was a cheap one. I'm Stu, and if you want more scary content, keep it here at GameSpot.com, and thank you for watching.